In this video, we're going to use the ISLM model that we've developed in the past in order to examine the role of aggregate demand shocks, which I'm going to explain what they are, and we're going to see how the governments might be able to respond to those shocks and maintain the stability of the economy in the short run. First, let's look at the impact of an adverse demand shock on income level, interest rate, and exchange rate. What is an adverse demand shock? For example, let's say investors become pessimistic and they invest less. The impact is going to be less expenditure on the economy, and the income level is going to fall for every level of interest rate. That means that the whole curve, the IS curve, is going to be shifting to the left. If there's no change in monetary policy, no change in price level, which we're going to take as given for now, the impact is going to be a reduction in the level of income and interest rate together. So interest rate drops to I1, income level drops to Y1. That's what an adverse or negative demand shock does. Now, suppose that the economy has been shocked this way, and income level Y0 is the initial level of income to which we want to return. If we want to maintain the stability of the economy, prevent income from going down too much, and interest rates also fluctuating, there may be some options that the central bank or the government can use in order to stimulate income back towards Y0 and up from the new level of income Y1. So after the shock, income level has gone to Y1, and we want to know how we can return to Y0 using fiscal or monetary policy. If we want to use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, the government has to spend more. And that way, the IS curve is going to shift back to its original position via fiscal stimulus. That could help the economy return to its initial level of income and interest rate. So that's one option, one way of responding to an adverse demand shock in the short run. I again emphasize that this is not a long-run policy or process, because we're not looking at the impact of these policies on expectations. We assume these are temporary measures and temporary shocks. The recovery of income could be also achieved using monetary policy. For doing that, the central bank can increase the money supply, help lower the interest rates, and stimulate investment and net exports. So let's see how we can use the IS and LM framework to figure out what happens in the economy as the central bank responds to this shock. Suppose that the central bank increases money supply. That causes the LM curve to become flatter. And as the LM curve becomes flatter, its crossing point with the new IS curve after shock is going to keep going down. And as a result, the economy is going to be moving along the IS1 down and drive the income level to Y0. This also means that interest rate is going to go further down to I2. So that's another way of reaching the old level of income or maintaining stability of the economy in the short run using monetary policy. Let's compare these two policies, fiscal and monetary policy. Suppose that the economy has reached point Y1, I1 because of a shock, and very quickly we want to return it back to Y0. Let's compare two alternative outcomes, one using pure fiscal policy, the other one using pure monetary policy. At point E, we're using only fiscal policy to raise the level of income. At point F, we're using only monetary policy to stimulate investment and net exports. Now, knowing what I just said, let's see what your answer is to the following question. What we want to know is what happens at point F compared to point E. Is private consumption higher or lower? Or maybe it's the same, or maybe higher, maybe lower. We can't tell. Just think about this for a moment and decide which answer you would choose. I hope you've chosen option C, no change, for a very obvious reason. Notice that income level is exactly the same for E and F, and that is what determines private consumption. Interest rate does not affect private consumption, and as a result, the difference in interest rate between these two situations does not have much bearing on the consumption outcome. Now, let's look at another question so that we fully understand what's happening at point E versus point F, and fiscal policy does versus monetary policy. Look at the possible answers to this question. We want to know at point F compared to point E, do we have more investment and net exports, less investment and net exports? Maybe one is higher, one is lower. Maybe they're the same. Take a look at these answers and choose the one that you think best represents the situation. Well, I hope you have chosen option A. At point F, we have more investment and net exports because interest rate is lower, and because of the lower interest rate, the exchange rate is lower. Now, knowing that the government and the central bank have options for manipulating expenditure, government expenditure, or money supply, and therefore pushing income levels higher in response to an adverse shock, a question arises whether the government should actually be using these tools on a regular basis, on an active basis, to stabilize the economy. Many economists think not, or at least when the shocks are small, there should not be any response. And here are the reasons for their position. Policy tools are imperfect for many reasons, and therefore it may not be a good idea to use them on a regular basis as active policy in response to small shocks. A major problem with fiscal policy is that it takes a long time before the policy is put into effect. Once we get the signal that the economy has been shocked and the income level is dropping, the government has to decide how much to spend more. But that decision is going to be going through legislature, through the executive. Decisions have to be made, where to spend, what to spend on, all the details. And in most countries, it takes between 3 to 9 months to come up with a solution to this. So between the time when we've recognized the beginning of a recession and the response, already many things have transpired. And it's possible that the economy may be recovering by itself, or a new shock has come and requires a new policy. But we're responding to the past policy, something that we've observed 9 months, a year before. That could actually mess up the economy and create a more chaotic situation than letting the economy recover by itself. This lag between the time when a recession starts and the time when the government responds is called inside lag, because that's due to the internal process of the government. Monetary policy may look like a better candidate for dealing with recessions, with short-term fluctuations, because changes in money supply can happen very quickly, and the impact on interest rates could be very quick. So the inside lag problem is not much of an issue as far as the monetary policy is concerned. But there's another problem here. When interest rates go down, we count on businesses and entrepreneurs to find projects and invest in them. That takes time because businesses have to find projects or go back and figure out what projects they wanted to implement, and be sure that by the time they start the projects, interest rates remain low. So it takes time between when the interest rate goes down and actually investment and net exports respond. And that's called outside lag because it's outside the policy process, but still the economy is not going to respond immediately. Usually it takes 6 months to 9 months for the impact of interest rates to show up in the actual expenditure and GDP. And on top of these two problems, there's another one called forecasting errors. Because we make policies that are going to become effective 6 months, 9 months later, we need to forecast what the situation is going to look like when the policy becomes effective. But we make a lot of mistakes in forecasting. We don't know what might happen in the economy, and we might be implementing a policy that becomes effective at the wrong time. If the economy is in a very short-term, few months recession, and we respond to it, and then by itself starts recovering, and on top of that we're increasing expenditure or we're increasing money supply, we could cause the economy to overheat and, in fact, destabilize the economy rather than stabilizing it. In order to show you the magnitude of forecast errors, here are some forecasts of oil prices by the U.S. Department of Energy around 1980-85, and also the forecast of oil prices in the 2000s by the International Monetary Fund. And as you can see, every time they made a forecast, soon the forecast became obsolete. For example, in 1981, the expectation was that after 1983, oil prices would rise very sharply. But that never happened. In fact, the oil prices went the other direction, actually. The dark line shows the actual trend, and the dotted lines represent forecasts in different years. In 2000s, the IMF was constantly forecasting and revising its forecast of oil prices. Every time, for example, in September 2004, they selected the current price and figured that that may continue, and even they were expecting some drop later on. What actually happened was quite the opposite. The price kept rising for years. So there are huge forecast errors, and as a result, it's very difficult to make policies that can stabilize the economy on a year-to-year basis. Of course, if the shock is very large and long-term, there may be something that one can do and should do, but we're going to come back to that later on. There's one other problem with active policymaking, and that's called timing consistency problem. This is a very complex problem because policymakers would like to convince economic agents that they will be following a certain policy in a certain way, responding to the economy's situation in a particular way. But then when actually those events happen, the policymaker may have a different incentive. For example, if inflation is very high, the policymaker might say that I will cut back on government expenditure or cut back on money supply in order to control inflation. But when actual inflation goes up and they want to cut back on government expenditure or reduce money supply, they may be worried that unemployment may go up, and therefore they may not actually implement what they have promised. This by itself could be problematic because businesses, knowing that the government will not go through, may actually continue raising their prices and exacerbate the inflation problem. So this is another aspect of active policy that may be causing more instability than stabilizing the economy. Before we end this video, I would like to discuss the impact of a temporary change in the price level on income level, interest rate, and exchange rate. This is going to come very handy later on when we're examining the role of inflation in the economy. So let's suppose that price level is at P0 and it goes up to P1. There's a parametric change in the price level. And let's see how we can analyze the consequences. I emphasize this is a temporary change in price level, not a permanent inflation rate. So starting from point Y0, I0, let's see what happens to the IS and LM curves when price level jumps up. As far as the LM curve is concerned, when prices go up, people need more money for their expenditures, for their transactions, and as a result, they're going to demand more money, they're going to send interest rates higher at every income level. This causes the LM curve to rotate upward, go to the position LM1. Let's now see what impact an increase in price level might have on the IS curve. First and foremost, a jump in the price level in the domestic price level for a given interest rate, and that also means a given exchange rate, implies an increase in the real exchange rate. That makes our producers less competitive compared to the rest of the world. And as a result, net exports should decline as a result of that. It's also possible that investment may go down. Why would investment go down as a result of an increase in the price level? Well, there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. One way to think about it is that whatever investment you wanted to make, you have to make that investment at a higher price now, and given the future returns that you expect, the incentive to invest declines. Another way of thinking about it is that if price level in the future is given, and we're assuming future as given for now, we're going to come back and see what happens if we think about changes in the future, how it affects our expectations and affects the economy as a whole. But for now, let's focus on a situation where the future is given and current price level goes up. That means that between now and the future, whatever inflation rate we expected is going to be lower. So we expect lower inflation rate, and a lower inflation rate means higher real interest rates and therefore lower investment. So this could be another factor that pushes the IS curve to the left. So IS curve shifts to the left, LM curve shifts upward or rotates upward. The result is that the new equilibrium is going to take place at a lower level of income. This graph also shows that the interest rate is going to be somewhat higher, but that's not necessary. The rate of interest after a jump in the price level could be higher or lower depending on how much the IS or the LM shift. And it's not necessary that it's higher or lower systematically. Let me summarize what we've done in this video and earlier examination of our IS and LM model. This table summarizes what we've done so far, and it's quite useful in answering a lot of questions about the impact of policies or shocks to the economy. For example, let's start with the first line that focuses on government consumption or fiscal policy. It shows that if government expenditure goes up, the IS shifts to the right. There's no mention of the LM curve, so LM curve remains put. The result is an increase in income, an increase in interest rates because of the interest parity condition, an increase in exchange rate, and a consequence reduction in net exports. You can look at the other variables as well and figure out how these effects come about. Note that some of the effects are shown by a question mark. That means that we don't know which way the result goes. For example, if money supply goes up, that causes the LM curve to rotate downward. That increases the level of income and lowers the interest rate and the exchange rate. But the impact on net exports is mixed because we get more net exports as a result of depreciation of the currency. At the same time, income level goes up, and that increases our imports and pushes down the net exports. As an exercise, take a look at the impact of expected inflation and see whether you understand the signs that I have on the right-hand side in response to an increase in expected inflation. Or, for example, the variable that we just examined, price level. See if it makes sense. As price level jumps up, what happens to the IS and LM curve, and also to the variables Y, I, E, and net exports. And make sure you understand why the effects on the last three variables are ambiguous.